My wealthy neighbor's black belt, son threw his mud-soaked mixed martial arts gloves directly at my boots and challenged me to a cage fight in front of the entire neighborhood. He smirked, utterly convinced he was about to humiliate the quiet, standoffish woman next door. He had absolutely no idea that before I moved back to this quiet suburban street, I was commanding elite operatives in the 75th Ranger Regiment. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Please like and subscribe if you have ever had arrogant people underestimate exactly what you are capable of. Growing up in Atlanta meant constantly navigating the suffocating weight of my mother's obsession with status. While other families celebrated milestones with genuine joy, my mother Evelyn viewed every life event as a calculated social climb. That toxic dynamic reached its boiling point on the 4th of July at my brother-in-law's sprawling estate. Trent Preston was a wildly successful white real estate developer who had married my younger sister Jada. To my mother, Trent was the ultimate trophy, the golden ticket that elevated our family into the upper echelons of Buckhead society. To me, he was just an arrogant vulture who had spent the last 6 months trying to erase our family's history. The afternoon sun was blistering, reflecting off Trent's massive infinity pool as the catered barbecue carried on around us. I sat quietly at a corner table on the patio, minding my own business and eating a plate of ribs. I had only attended this lavish neighborhood gathering because Jada begged me to maintain family harmony. I should have known better. Harmony in this family always came at my expense. The clinking of crystal glasses and the low hum of jazz music abruptly stopped when Trent marched across the limestone patio, his expensive loafers clicking sharply against the stone. He did not come to offer me a fresh drink. Instead, he slammed a thick manila envelope right on top of my food, sending barbecue sauce splattering across the table. "Sign it," Trent demanded, his voice carrying easily over the sudden silence of the crowd. "I am done playing nice, Sienna. The city zoning board approved my expansion project this morning." I pulled a few strings, greased the right palms, and got the eminent domain order pushed through. "Your grandmother's dilapidated little house is getting bulldozed next month so I can extend my private golf course. Take the $20,000 buyout and leave before I have the sheriff drag you out." I slowly wiped the sauce off my wrist with a napkin, staring at the legal threat. He was trying to legally steal the only piece of heritage my grandmother had left behind, a home she had worked 3 jobs to pay off. Before I could even form a response, the crowd parted again. This time it was Hunter, Trent's 22-year-old brother. Hunter was an amateur mixed martial arts champion, heavily tattooed, and currently riding the high of a local winning streak. He possessed the exact same toxic arrogance as his brother, mixed with a dangerous dose of youthful recklessness. Hunter swaggered up to my table holding a pair of training gloves. With a sneer that twisted his face, he tossed the heavy sweat-stained gloves directly at my feet, leaving streaks of dirt on my leather boots. "I hear you used to play dress-up in the military," Hunter mocked, crossing his muscular arms. "A little desk duty pushing papers for the army, right? Well, my brother is hosting a charity fight night at the end of the month. If you are so tough, why do not you step into the cage with me for an exhibition match? I will even tie one hand behind my back for the diversity hire." The racial and sexist undertones of his comment hung heavily in the humid air. Several of Trent's wealthy friends chuckled into their drinks. "Here is the deal," Hunter continued, leaning over the table to get in my face. "If you can last 3 minutes in the cage with me without crying, I will tell Trent to drop the eminent domain claim. You get to keep your pathetic little shack. But when I knock you out, you sign the deed over to my brother for free. Pack your trash and get the hell out of our neighborhood." I looked from the muddy gloves on the ground to Hunter's smug face, feeling the familiar icy calm of a combat zone settling over my mind. Before I could speak, my mother rushed over, her face flushed with panic. But she did not come to defend me. She never did. "Sienna, stop this right now," Evelyn hissed, grabbing my shoulder and shaking it. "Are you trying to embarrass us in front of Trent's entire family? You dropped out of medical school 15 years ago to run off with the army, and you have been a bitter masculine disappointment ever since. Look at Jada. She married into true wealth and class. Trent is offering you $20,000 for that rotting house. Stop being so stubborn. Apologize to Hunter and sign the damn papers." Jada stood a few feet away, sipping a mimosa, watching me with a mixture of pity and disdain. "Just sign it, Sienna," she chimed in. "You do not belong here anyway." They thought I was just a washed-up broke veteran who would fold under the pressure of their combined wealth and social intimidation. They thought I was defenseless. I stood up my chair, scraping loudly against the stone. I calmly kicked the muddy MMA gloves straight up off the ground, catching them smoothly in my right hand. I tossed them hard into Hunter's chest, forcing him to stumble back a step. "Draw up the contract," I said, my voice deadpan and dangerously quiet. "But let us make it interesting. When I win, Trent transfers his entire estate's equity over to me." Trent threw his head back and laughed, a booming, arrogant sound that echoed across the patio. "You are completely delusional, Sienna. But fine. I will have my lawyers draft the paperwork tonight. I cannot wait to watch my brother humble you in front of the entire city." I did not smile. I did not raise my voice. I just picked up my keys and walked away from the table, leaving them to their cruel jokes. Later that evening, the glowing screen of my smartphone illuminated the dark living room of my grandmother's house. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a text from Jada. "We just froze your personal bank accounts," the message read. "Trent made one phone call to the branch manager. You have exactly $0 to your name. Good luck trying to hire a lawyer to review that contract, loser." I stared at the text message for a long moment, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the empty house. The sheer audacity of their entitlement was almost amusing. They genuinely believed that freezing a standard checking account would leave me helpless and destitute. I picked up my phone and typed a quick, simple reply. "No worries. See you at the fight." Then I set the phone face down and reached for my encrypted laptop. I bypassed the standard banking portals entirely and initiated a secure biometric login. The screen flashed green, welcoming me to the executive treasury portal of Aegis Global. The balance loaded instantly, displaying $85 million in liquid corporate assets. I smiled in the dark, preparing for war. The $85 million staring back at me from the encrypted screen wasn't just money. It was the culmination of 15 years of blood, tactical precision, and a ruthless refusal to be a victim of circumstance. When I dropped out of medical school all those years ago, my mother had treated it like a death in the family. She had paraded my acceptance letters around her country club friends for months, wearing my academic success as her own personal accessory. When I traded a white coat for standard issue camouflage and a one-way ticket to basic training, she told me I was throwing my life away. She stopped mentioning my name at her Sunday card games. To Evelyn, I ceased to exist the moment I stopped serving her social agenda. But the military gave me something Buckhead society never could: absolute clarity. I thrived in the grueling, unforgiving environment of the 75th Ranger Regiment. I learned how to read a room for exits, how to dismantle an insurgency, and how to command respect from Tier 1 operators, who initially looked at me with the exact same skepticism as Trent Preston. I didn't just push papers. I orchestrated covert extractions in hostile territories where a single miscalculation meant bringing my team home in body bags. It was during a highly classified extraction in the notorious Kunar province that I truly learned the difference between the family you are born into and the family you forge in fire. I was commanding a specialized Ranger recon element tasked with monitoring a hostile valley that had already claimed the lives of 24 coalition soldiers that year. The heat was oppressive, baking the arid earth until the air itself tasted like copper and dust. Darius wasn't my COO back then. He was a seasoned Tier 1 operator from a completely different, highly secretive special mission unit. His designated strike team had been inserted 3 miles north of our position to capture a high-value insurgent financier. The intelligence they had been given was catastrophically flawed. They didn't walk into a safe house. They walked into a heavily fortified ambush. I was listening to the encrypted radio chatter when everything went to hell. The sharp, panicked crackle of gunfire bled through the comms, followed by Darius's voice, remarkably steady, despite the chaos, reporting that his team was pinned down in a rocky ravine. They had multiple casualties. They were taking heavy RPG fire from the high ground, and their primary exfiltration helicopter had been waved off due to intense anti-aircraft hostility. The brass back at the Joint Operations Center told me to hold my position. They ordered my team to stand down, calculating that sending a small Ranger element into a kill zone to rescue a stranded Black Ops team was a statistical suicide mission. They were prepared to write Darius and his men off as acceptable collateral damage to protect the broader operational footprint. I have never been good at following orders that lack humanity. Growing up in a house where my own mother treated me as an acceptable sacrifice for her social climbing had hardwired me to despise commanders who discarded their people. I clicked my radio off, looking at the 5 elite operatives under my direct command. I didn't give a speech. I just pointed north and we moved. We navigated the treacherous mountainous terrain at a brutal sprint, carrying heavy weapons and extra medical gear. When we crested the ridge overlooking the ravine, the situation was worse than the radio let on. Darius was bleeding from shrapnel in his shoulder, dragging one of his unconscious men behind a crumbling mud brick wall, while tracers illuminated the valley floor in a deadly crossfire. We didn't wait for permission. My squad established immediate devastating tactical overwatch. I personally set up a heavy sniper position on the ridge, identifying the primary hostile machine gun nests that had Darius pinned. I controlled my breathing, slowed my heart rate, and systematically neutralized the enemy gunners with absolute terrifying precision. Every time an insurgent stepped up to fire on Darius's crippled team, they were met with lethal force from the sky. Under the umbrella of our continuous heavy suppressing fire, we carved a bloody corridor right through the ambush line. We physically carried Darius's wounded men out of that ravine, fighting inch by bloody inch, until we reached a secondary extraction zone, completely off the grid. We held that perimeter for 4 agonizing hours until a rogue dust-off pilot finally agreed to land. Later that night, in the sterile, blood-scented confines of the field hospital tent at Bagram Airfield, Darius walked over to my cot. His arm was in a sling, his face covered in soot and dried blood. He didn't offer a traditional military salute. He just looked at me, a woman who had defied direct orders and risked a court-martial to save a team that wasn't even hers, and extended his hand. "The generals left us to die," Darius said, his gravelly voice thick with exhaustion and newfound reverence. "You didn't. When my contract is up, I don't work for the suits in Washington anymore. I work for you. Whatever you build, wherever you go, I am your shield." He kept that promise. We recognized a shared, uncompromising vision in the dirt and chaos of that deployment. The private military sector was bloated, inefficient, and run by corporate executives who had never taken a bullet, men who treated operators exactly the way Trent Preston treated his contractors, as disposable assets. When our deployments ended, we didn't quietly retire to desk jobs. We revolutionized the industry. Along with Marcus, a cyber intelligence prodigy, I had recruited out of a joint task force initiative we founded, Aegis Global. We started small, offering bespoke cybersecurity and physical extraction protocols for high-net-worth individuals traveling through active war zones. Within 5 years, our efficiency and absolute discretion won us multi-billion-dollar federal defense contracts. We became the shadow army for the global elite, operating entirely off the grid. My mother and sister thought I was a struggling, traumatized veteran living off a meager military pension because I chose to drive a sensible truck and live in my grandmother's quiet house. I let them believe it. Anonymity was the greatest armor money could buy. I closed the Treasury portal on my laptop and immediately opened a direct encrypted video uplink to Marcus. The screen split, revealing my cyber director sitting in the sterile, neon-lit server room of our underground Atlanta headquarters. "Commander," Marcus said, his voice crisp through the encrypted connection. "I monitored the localized comms chatter. You had an altercation at the Preston estate today." "Trent Preston pushed an eminent domain order through the city zoning board," I stated, leaning back into the worn fabric of my grandmother's sofa. "He wants to bulldoze this property for a golf course extension. I need a full, unrestricted financial autopsy on his entire corporate structure, Marcus. I want to know exactly who owns his debt, who holds his mortgages, and where he is currently bleeding capital." Marcus's fingers flew across his mechanical keyboard, the rapid clacking echoing through the speakers. "Initiating a deep dive algorithm into Preston Real Estate Holdings. Give me 60 seconds. I watched the lines of code reflect in Marcus's glasses. Trent Preston carried himself like a billionaire, but my tactical training taught me that loud, arrogant men were almost always compensating for massive structural vulnerabilities. Got him, Marcus announced, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. Trent is highly leveraged Sienna. Dangerously so. He has been taking out massive equity lines of credit to fund his new commercial developments because his residential sales have flatlined for 3 consecutive quarters. His primary creditor is a mid-sized lending firm called Apex Credit. Apex Credit, I repeated, committing the name to memory. What is their current market vulnerability? They are aggressive but incredibly overextended, Marcus read from his glowing monitors. They specialize in high-interest predatory loans for developers who can't secure traditional banking capital. But here's the critical intel: Apex suffered a massive data breach last month that they haven't disclosed to their shareholders yet. Their stock is quietly plummeting, and their board of directors is actively panicking. They are ripe for a hostile takeover, Commander. I looked out the window into the quiet, dark suburban street. Trent thought he had cornered me with a $20,000 buyout and a local zoning board signature. I was playing checkers and I was about to flip the entire board. Marcus, I said, my voice cold and entirely devoid of hesitation. Draft an aggressive all-cash acquisition proposal for Apex Credit. Offer a 10% premium above their closing stock price from this afternoon. Contact Darius and have him assemble our corporate acquisitions legal team. I want the takeover finalized and the ink dried before Trent even wakes up tomorrow. Understood, Marcus replied, already typing the mobilization orders. We will swallow Apex Credit whole. By morning, you will personally own every single dollar of debt Trent Preston currently owes. The takeover was a masterpiece of corporate warfare executed with the same ruthless efficiency as a midnight raid. While Trent was sleeping soundly in his custom-built mansion, dreaming of his golf course expansion, my legal team systematically dismantled his financial safety net. At 6:00 a.m., the board of Apex Credit, terrified by the looming scandal of their undisclosed data breach, eagerly accepted my anonymous holding company's all-cash offer. By 8:00 a.m., the massive portfolios of debt were officially transferred to Aegis Global's secure servers. Trent Preston had signed away his grandmother's house thinking I was a pawn. He had absolutely no idea he had just handed the deed of his entire life over to the Queen. The digital clock on my bedside table flipped to 2 in the morning. Sleep was a luxury I rarely indulged in when a confirmed threat was actively targeting my perimeter. I sat in the darkness of my grandmother's living room, listening to the rhythmic chirping of the cicadas outside. Trent and Hunter Preston were not the type of men to wait patiently for a sanctioned fight. Arrogance bred impatience, and cowards always preferred to strike under the cover of darkness. My instincts, haunted by years of commanding night operations, told me they would try to break my spirit long before I ever stepped foot inside their charity cage. I did not have to wait long to be proven right. The silent alarm on my smartphone vibrated against the wooden coffee table, flashing a subtle red warning. My property was rigged with military-grade motion sensors, a minor perk of owning a global security empire. I tapped the screen, pulling up the thermal imaging feed from the cameras hidden in the oak trees lining my driveway. 3 distinct heat signatures were moving aggressively through the shadows, creeping toward the front porch. I smoothly rose from the sofa, my bare feet making no sound against the vintage hardwood floor. I moved to the window and parted the heavy curtains just a fraction of an inch. Through the glass, I could clearly see the men Hunter had sent to intimidate me. They were massive, clad entirely in black with bandanas pulled up over the lower halves of their faces. One carried a heavy metal baseball bat, another gripped a thick steel chain, and the third held a large industrial can of red spray paint. They intended to vandalize my home, terrorize me into submission, and leave a racist, threatening message right on my front door. An ordinary civilian would have panicked. A normal person would have scrambled for the phone, dialed emergency services, and hidden in a closet while praying the police arrived in time. But I knew exactly how things worked in this upscale, predominantly white neighborhood. If I called the local authorities, the dispatch would be slow, the response would be skeptical, and Trent Preston would likely have the responding officers in his deep pockets by morning. I was not about to rely on a broken system to protect my family's legacy. I reached for my encrypted phone, but I did not dial 911. Instead, I pressed a single pre-programmed speed dial button. The line did not even ring before a crisp, professional voice answered on the other end. I gave a short alphanumeric authorization code, followed by my exact coordinates and a brief description of the hostels. The voice simply replied with confirmation, stating that the local quick reaction force was already mobilized and less than 2 minutes away. I ended the call and slipped my phone into the pocket of my tactical cargo pants. The thugs were now creeping up the steps of my porch, their heavy boots thudding clumsily against the painted wood. They moved with the sloppy, uncoordinated aggression of street brawlers, oblivious to the fact that they had just walked into a fatal trap. I walked into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and pulled out a glass pitcher of cold sweet tea. I poured myself a tall glass, the ice cubes clinking softly against the rim. I was not going to hide in the shadows. I walked straight to the front door, unlocked the deadbolt with a loud, deliberate click, and swung the heavy oak door wide open. The three men froze instantly. The thug with the spray paint dropped his arms, staring at me in total shock. I stood framed in the doorway, illuminated only by the pale yellow glow of the porch light, casually taking a slow sip of my sweet tea. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not scream. I just looked at them with the cold, deadpan stare of a commander assessing enemy combatants. Before the man with the baseball bat could recover his wits and raise his weapon, the quiet suburban street was suddenly bathed in the blinding glare of high-beam headlights. Two matte black sport utility vehicles with heavily tinted windows and zero license plates glided silently to the curb, cutting off any potential avenue of escape. The doors of the vehicles swung open in perfect, terrifying synchronization. 5 Aegis tactical operatives stepped out onto the asphalt. They were dressed in plain clothes, wearing dark denim and fitted black shirts, but the way they moved gave away their elite military background immediately. They advanced on my property, with terrifying speed and absolute silence, fanning out in a flawless tactical formation that completely surrounded the 3 hired thugs. The men on my porch panicked, dropping their weapons, as they realized they were vastly outmatched. The takedown was a masterclass in brutal efficiency. There were no theatrical punches or loud shouts. In less than 30 seconds, the Aegis operatives had disarmed, subdued, and neutralized the threat. Knees connected with ribs, arms were twisted into agonizing submission holds, and bodies were slammed face first into the manicured grass. Heavy-duty plastic zip ties were secured tightly around their wrists and ankles, rendering them completely immobile. The operation was clinical, precise, and entirely silent, save for the muffled groans of the defeated men. The team leader, a towering man with a military fade, looked up at me from the lawn and gave a sharp, respectful nod of his head. I returned the nod, taking another long, refreshing sip of my iced tea. I stepped out onto the porch, leaning comfortably against the wooden railing. I watched as the operatives melted back into the shadows of their vehicles, leaving Hunter's personal attack dogs trussed up on the curb like garbage bags, waiting for the morning trash collection to arrive. I took a final sip of my tea, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. The real war had only just officially begun. I didn't actually wait for the morning to deal with the garbage on my lawn. Within 10 minutes of my Aegis operatives fading back into the shadows, 2 unmarked police cruisers rolled silently up my driveway, their emergency lights strictly deactivated. This wasn't a standard 911 dispatch. When you command a global security empire that routinely consults for federal law enforcement, local precinct captains tend to owe you a favor or two. I watched from the shadows of my porch as 4 uniformed officers loaded the groaning zip-tied thugs into the back of their cruisers with aggressive efficiency. They didn't knock on my door, they didn't ask for a statement, and they certainly didn't wake the wealthy neighbors. It was a ghost operation. An hour later, I was sitting at my kitchen island with my laptop open, watching a live, highly encrypted video feed directly from Interrogation Room 3 at the downtown precinct. Aegis didn't just have tactical operators. We had a legal division composed of former federal prosecutors who were absolutely ruthless. One of my senior legal fixers, a sharply dressed woman named Vance, was standing in the small gray interrogation room with the three thugs. They had been chained to the steel table, their black bandanas removed, revealing the bruised and terrified faces of local street enforcers who realized they had bitten off far more than they could chew. The thug who had been holding the baseball bat tried to puff out his chest, feigning ignorance. "We weren't doing nothing," he mumbled, refusing to look Vance in the eye. "Just walking through the neighborhood. We got jumped by some military guys. You can't hold us." Vance didn't yell. She didn't slam her hands on the table like a cliché television detective. She calmly opened a manila folder and slid 3 high-definition 8x10 photographs across the aluminum table. They were crystal clear thermal images of the men trespassing on my property, armed with blunt weapons and spray paint. "Let me explain your current reality to you," Vance said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "You weren't just trespassing on a residential property. The home you attempted to vandalize is legally registered as the primary off-site command perimeter for the chief executive officer of a Tier 1 federal defense contractor. Under the newly revised Patriot Act clauses, your little midnight intimidation tactic is being classified as an attempted domestic terror strike against a federal asset." The color completely drained from the faces of all three men. The thug who had held the chains swallowed hard, his tough guy facade crumbling into genuine panic. "Terrorism, lady, you're crazy. We were just hired to scare some chick out of her house." "Hired by whom?" Vance asked instantly, her eyes locking onto him like a laser. The men exchanged nervous glances. "We don't know his name," the third thug lied, shifting uncomfortably in his metal chair. "Some rich kid in a sports car. Paid us in cash." Vance smiled, but it was a cold, surgical expression. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a clear plastic evidence bag containing a thick stack of crisp $100 bills. "We already impounded your vehicle and seized your payment." You see, the problem with wealthy, arrogant amateurs is that they never think about the digital trail. We ran the serial numbers on these bills through the Federal Treasury database 10 minutes ago. They were sequentially withdrawn from a primary checking account at a Buckhead branch yesterday afternoon. The account belongs to Hunter Preston. Vance leaned over the table, bringing her face inches from the man who had held the baseball bat. "Here is the deal. You are currently facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary for domestic terrorism, armed conspiracy, and attempted hate crimes. However, if you sign a sworn, legally binding affidavit directly implicating Hunter Preston for financing and ordering this attack, my client will generously downgrade the charges to simple misdemeanor trespassing. You have exactly 60 seconds to decide if you want to spend the rest of your youth in a federal cage to protect a spoiled rich kid who sees you as entirely disposable." It didn't take 60 seconds. It took less than 10. The men tripped over themselves to confess, pouring out every detail of Hunter's desperate, arrogant plan. They confirmed Hunter had approached them outside a local MMA gym, handing them the cash and explicit instructions to paint racist threats on my grandmother's door to break me psychologically before the charity fight. Vance slid 3 pens across the table, and they signed the affidavits with trembling hands. Sitting in my dark kitchen, I closed the laptop screen. I now had Hunter Preston dead to rights on felony conspiracy charges safely locked away in my legal arsenal. But I wasn't going to hand it over to the police yet. I wanted him to step into that cage completely oblivious to the fact that his own destruction was already a legal certainty. The bright morning sun slowly crept through the sheer curtains of my living room, casting long shadows across the vintage hardwood floors. I stood at the kitchen island, methodically grinding dark roast coffee beans. Outside, the local police had come and gone hours ago, quietly scooping up the 3 zip-tied thugs from my curb without flashing their sirens. My legal team at Aegis Global had already forwarded the precinct's arrest reports to my encrypted inbox. Hunter's hired muscle had folded immediately in the interrogation room, singing like canaries about the wealthy young mixed martial arts fighter who had paid them in crisp $100 bills to terrorize me. I poured boiling water into my French press, inhaling the rich, earthy aroma. The house was peaceful, but my tactical mindset knew the silence was merely the eye of the storm. Trent Preston was a man who operated on ego and aggressive retaliation. Since his physical intimidation tactic had failed so spectacularly in the middle of the night, I knew his next move would involve public humiliation and financial leverage. Right on cue, the heavy brass knocker on my front door began to pound with frantic, aggressive rhythm. I did not rush. I slowly pressed the plunger down on my coffee maker, poured myself a steaming mug, and walked down the hallway. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the oak door open. My mother Evelyn stood on the porch, her face pinched with a mixture of panic and righteous indignation. Beside her stood my younger sister Jada, wearing oversized designer sunglasses and clutching a thick, expensive leather handbag. Neither of them waited for an invitation. They pushed past me, marching directly into my grandmother's living room, as if they owned the property. "You really stepped in it this time, Sienna," Jada sneered, pulling off her sunglasses to glare at me. "Did you honestly think you could embarrass Trent in front of his entire network and just get away with it? You have no idea how power works in this city." Before I could take a sip of my coffee, Evelyn reached into her designer tote bag and pulled out a freshly printed copy of the local society newspaper. She practically threw it across the coffee table, the glossy pages sliding until they hit a stack of my grandmother's old photo albums. "Look at what you have done to this family's reputation," my mother demanded, her voice trembling with misplaced rage. "Read the front page, Sienna. Read it and tell me how you plan to fix this catastrophic mess." I casually picked up the newspaper, keeping my expression entirely neutral. Trent had certainly moved fast, utilizing his deep pockets to buy a prime piece of local journalism. The bold black headline took up half the page. "Upscale community terrorized by unstable combat traumatized veteran." Below the headline was a highly edited, unflattering photograph of me from my early military days, juxtaposed against a pristine shot of Trent's luxury golf course. The article was a masterpiece of character assassination. It painted me as a deeply disturbed former soldier, suffering from severe post-traumatic stress disorder. It claimed I was a danger to the wealthy residents, a ticking time bomb who hoarded weapons and picked unprovoked fights with upstanding citizens at neighborhood barbecues. Trent had paid an anonymous source, likely one of his country club friends, to claim they feared for their children's safety with me living next door. I glanced down at the paperwork. The bold black text at the top of the page spelled out exactly what this visit was truly about. It was a comprehensive relinquishment form. "All you have to do," Vivian continued, crossing her arms over her chest, "is sign over the operational security clearance for David's artificial intelligence software to the board of directors. And more importantly, you will sign this secondary addendum immediately relinquishing your legal guardianship of your nephew." Jada let out a harsh, mocking laugh, pacing across the vintage rug. "You think this is a joke? You think you can just brush this off like one of your little military exercises? Trent is not just ruining your reputation, Sienna. He is destroying your entire life. You crossed the wrong man. He is a multi-millionaire real estate mogul, and you are just a stubborn woman clinging to a house you cannot even afford to keep." I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the dark roast warm my throat. "I can afford the property taxes just fine, Jada. This house is fully paid off. Grandma saw to that before she passed away." My mother suddenly looked away, refusing to meet my eyes. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, staring intently at the fireplace. The sudden shift in her body language immediately triggered my tactical awareness. A new, far more dangerous threat was about to be revealed. Jada stopped pacing. A vicious, triumphant smile spread across her perfectly contoured face. She reached into her expensive handbag and pulled out a crisp white legal document. She walked over and placed it deliberately on the kitchen island, right next to my coffee press. "Grandma paid off the original mortgage, sure," Jada said, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "But you were deployed overseas for 3 years, Sienna. You left Mom with the power of attorney over the estate to handle the basic utility bills and property taxes while you were playing war hero in the desert. Did you really think Mom was going to let you hoard this asset while my husband was trying to expand his business?" I looked down at the document. It was a formal notice of default and impending foreclosure. "What did you do, Mother?" I asked, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. Evelyn finally looked at me, lifting her chin defensively. I did what I had to do for this family. When Trent needed extra capital to secure the initial zoning permits for his golf course expansion last year, I took out a massive equity loan against this house. I used the power of attorney you gave me. I leveraged this property to help your sister's husband. That is family. Now you have exactly 24 hours to pack all your bags and leave this property immediately. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not panic. My mother stood in my living room, her chest heaving with the exertion of delivering what she believed was a fatal blow to my independence. Jada mirrored her triumphant posture, waiting for me to break down, beg for mercy, or start packing my bags. Instead, I reached into the back pocket of my tactical cargo pants. I bypassed my phone and pulled out a neatly folded piece of thick watermarked paper. I took a deliberate step forward and dropped the document onto the kitchen island, right on top of the impending foreclosure notice they had so proudly presented. You really should have your husband teach you how to read the fine print on commercial loans, Jada. I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Or at the very least, you should pay closer attention to the financial news. Your husband took out that massive equity line of credit through Apex Credit. They are a mid-sized, aggressive lending firm known for predatory interest rates. Jada scoffed, crossing her arms defensively. What does that matter? Trent got the cash he needed and the bank holds the deed to this house. You are still getting evicted, Sienna. Apex Credit does not hold the deed anymore. I corrected her, tapping my index finger against the watermarked paper I had just placed on the counter. Read the wire transfer receipt, little sister. Apex Credit was quietly acquired 2 weeks ago in a hostile corporate takeover. The parent company that bought out all of their active debt portfolios, including your husband's $3 million mansion loan, is my company. I own the debt. Jada's smug expression vanished in a fraction of a second. The color completely drained from her face as she leaned over the kitchen island, her eyes frantically scanning the dense legal jargon printed on the receipt. You see, Mother. I continued, turning my cold gaze back to Evelyn, who was now trembling visibly. When you illegally leveraged my property to fund Trent's golf course, you tied his financial survival to this house. Because I now own the parent company that holds his debt, I hold the leverage. If he tries to foreclose on my grandmother's house, I will immediately call in his $3 million loan. He does not have the liquid cash to pay me back. If he misses the deadline by a single minute, I will foreclose on his luxury estate. I will take his cars, his golf course, and the very roof over your precious daughter's head. Jada let out a strangled gasp. Her trembling hands dropped the paper as if it had physically burned her. She did not bother to argue. She did not bother to wait for our mother. She spun around on her designer heels and sprinted out the front door, desperately dialing Trent's number on her phone as she ran toward her car. The dynamic had completely flipped. While Jada was frantically speeding away from my grandmother's house, dialing her husband in a state of absolute hysteria, I was securely logged into the executive comms channel of Aegis Global. The real beauty of a flawlessly executed tactical ambush is that the enemy never realizes they are completely surrounded until the exact moment you pull the trigger. In the penthouse boardroom of our heavily fortified corporate headquarters in downtown Atlanta, Darius was preparing for his morning meetings. The room was a masterclass in modern, intimidating minimalism, black marble, soundproof glass, and sweeping panoramic views of the city skyline. Darius stood at the head of a massive obsidian conference table, buttoning his custom-tailored suit over a frame built by years of elite military combat. Beside him stood two of our top corporate litigators, both former Department of Justice sharks, who had left federal service for the unlimited resources of private military contracting. My voice echoed through the encrypted surround sound speakers built into the boardroom ceiling. Status report, Darius. Darius checked his platinum wristwatch, a ghost of a smile playing on his typically stoic face. Good morning, Commander. Marcus forwarded the finalized Apex Credit acquisition files an hour ago. We legally own Preston Real Estate Holdings' entire commercial and residential debt portfolio. The trap is fully set and currently active. Trent's wife just left my property. I informed them, keeping my voice analytical and cold. She saw the wire transfer receipt. I expect Trent to enter a state of severe financial panic within the next 15 minutes. He is heavily overleveraged. Based on Marcus's psychological profiling, Trent's immediate stress response will be to liquidate his largest operational overheads to generate emergency cash. One of the litigators, a sharp-eyed man named Hayes, tapped his digital tablet. His largest operational overhead is our private security contract commander. He pays us a massive monthly retainer to guard his luxury high-rises and active construction sites. Exactly, I said. He is going to try to cancel the contract and demand his escrow funds be released back to him today to cover the loans we now hold. He operates under the delusion that he is a corporate heavyweight who can bully local vendors into breaking ironclad contracts. Darius chuckled a deep rumbling sound. He clearly hasn't read the master service agreement he signed 3 years ago. Our penalty clauses for abrupt, unprovoked termination are incredibly predatory by design. I don't want him just penalized. I commanded the icy authority in my voice, silencing the room. I want him financially eviscerated. When he inevitably demands an emergency termination meeting this morning, you will grant it immediately. Let him scream. Let him throw his weight around. And when he demands his money, you will drop the maximum breach of contract penalty right on his mahogany desk. $10 million payable in 7 days, Darius confirmed, picking up a freshly printed crisp sheet of paper from the printer. It was the invoice that would break Trent Preston's back. He won't have the liquidity. It will push his entire corporate structure into immediate catastrophic default. Make sure he understands he is dealing with a global entity that could crush him by lunch, I instructed. And Darius, when he demands to speak to the CEO to beg for a waiver, tell him exactly where he can find me this weekend. Consider it done, Commander, Darius replied, sliding the $10 million penalty invoice into a sleek leather portfolio. We will march into his corporate boardroom and deliver the payload. Happy hunting. The comms channel clicked off. I sat quietly in my kitchen sipping my dark roast coffee. I had just deployed my most lethal corporate operators to systematically dismantle his financial safety net. Trent Preston was a dead man walking, and he was about to spend the rest of his day digging his own grave. Across town, inside the gleaming glass and steel skyscraper of Preston Real Estate Holdings, the walls were about to cave in. Trent sat behind his massive mahogany desk, reviewing blueprints for his golf course expansion, entirely convinced of his own invincibility. When his phone rang and Jada delivered the hysterical news, his smug arrogance shattered into pure, unadulterated panic. He realized instantly that his immediate financial leverage over me was completely gone. Worse, his own empire was standing on the edge of a catastrophic cliff. Trent was heavily over-leveraged. He had borrowed against everything he owned to fund his ambitious developments, playing a dangerous game of financial roulette. With me now holding the leash on his primary residential debt, he needed liquid cash, and he needed it immediately. If he did not free up millions of dollars by the end of the week, I could legally seize his entire life. Furious and sweating through his custom-tailored suit, Trent scrambled for a lifeline. He frantically reviewed his corporate expense reports, searching for massive expenditures he could liquidate or cancel. His eyes landed on his largest operational overhead, an exclusive ironclad contract with a premier private security firm that guarded all of his luxury high-rises and active construction sites across Atlanta. It was a multi-million-dollar annual retainer. If he could abruptly terminate the contract and claw back the escrow funds, he could generate enough cash to temporarily hold me off. Trent slammed his hands down on his desk, his face red with desperation. He stormed out of his private office, barking aggressive orders at his terrified assistants. He demanded they set up an emergency termination meeting with the security providers immediately. He did not care about termination clauses or penalty fees. He operated under the delusion that his status as a wealthy real estate mogul allowed him to bully any contractor into submission. Less than an hour later, Trent marched into his glass-walled corporate boardroom. He was practically vibrating with rage. 3 executive representatives from the private security firm were already seated around the long conference table, dressed in immaculate dark suits. They sat perfectly still, their posture rigid and disciplined, exuding an aura of quiet, dangerous authority that Trent completely ignored. Trent did not offer a handshake. He slammed his leather briefcase onto the table and pointed an accusatory finger at the lead executive. "We are done," Trent snarled, his voice echoing loudly off the glass walls. I am canceling the massive corporate security contract for Preston Real Estate Holdings effective immediately. I want the entire balance of my escrow account released and wired back to my primary banking institution by the end of business today. Do not try to quote penalty clauses to me. If you refuse to release my funds immediately, I will tie your firm up in so much litigation that you will go bankrupt before we ever see the inside of a courtroom. The three security executives did not flinch. They did not look intimidated by his loud threats. The lead executive, a broad-shouldered man named Darius, reached into his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a silver pen and placed it on the mahogany table. The quiet click echoed in the boardroom, a stark contrast to Trent's screaming. Darius was a former military operator and currently my chief operating officer at Aegis Global. He had faced warlords in active combat zones alongside me. A panicked real estate developer having a temper tantrum was not going to make him sweat. Mr. Preston, Darius began, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded absolute attention. I strongly advise you to lower your voice and take a seat. We are professionals, and we will conduct this meeting as such. You do not dictate terms to our firm, and you certainly do not issue threats. Trent's face flushed a deep red. He slammed his fist against an empty leather chair. Do you have any idea who you are talking to? I am your biggest client. I own half the commercial real estate in this district. If I cancel this contract, your local branch goes under. Now I want my escrow funds wired back to my accounts immediately. We are officially terminating our business relationship. Darius exchanged an amused glance with the two executives beside him. He calmly opened his portfolio, extracted a thick stack of legal documents, and slid them across the polished wood until they rested in front of Trent. You are not our biggest client, Mr. Preston, Darius corrected smoothly. In fact, your account barely registers on our global portfolio. However, we take our contractual obligations very seriously. The documents you are looking at constitute the master service agreement you signed 3 years ago. I suggest you turn to Section 8 regarding immediate termination of services. Trent snatched the documents off the table, his eyes darting frantically across the dense legal text. As he read, his breathing became shallow and erratic. The false bravado that usually carried him through his corporate bullying began to evaporate, replaced by cold, hard panic. This cannot be right, Trent muttered, his voice cracking slightly. This says I forfeit the entire escrow balance if I terminate without a documented breach of service on your end. That is absolutely correct, Darius confirmed, leaning back in his chair and folding his hands. Our firm deployed hundreds of highly trained tactical personnel, advanced surveillance technology, and armored vehicles to secure your properties. We dedicated massive resources to your infrastructure. You cannot simply pull the plug because you suddenly find yourself experiencing a personal liquidity crisis. Trent threw the contract back onto the table. This is extortion. I will have my legal team tear this document to shreds. You are holding my money hostage, and I need that capital today. It is not extortion, Darius replied coolly. It is business. And frankly, Mr. Preston, things are about to get significantly worse for you. Darius snapped his fingers. The executive sitting to his right opened a separate folder and withdrew a single crisp sheet of paper. He slid it across the table to Trent. What is this? Trent demanded, staring at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. That is your penalty invoice, Darius explained, his voice entirely devoid of sympathy. Because you are attempting to abruptly terminate a multi-year high-security infrastructure contract without cause, you have triggered the maximum penalty clause. You do not just forfeit the millions sitting in escrow. You now owe our firm an immediate breach of contract fee of exactly $10 million, payable within 7 business days. Trent looked like he had just been physically struck. He staggered backward, his knees hitting the edge of a leather chair. He gripped the armrest to steady himself, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster he had just created. He had walked into the room hoping to free up a few $1,000,000 to save his private estate from my foreclosure. Instead, he had just instantly multiplied his catastrophic debt. $10 million, Trent whispered, staring blankly at the executives. I do not have $10 million in liquid cash. You are trying to bankrupt me. We are simply enforcing the agreement you eagerly signed, Darius stated. Trent's shock quickly morphed back into desperate cornered rage. He lunged forward, slamming both hands onto the table, his eyes wild and bloodshot. I want to speak to your boss. I want to speak to the CEO of this firm right now, who is running this operation. Give me their name and a direct phone number. I will explain the situation and they will waive this ridiculous penalty. I am Trent Preston. I demand to speak to the person in charge. Darius slowly stood up from the table, buttoning his suit jacket with meticulous precision. He looked down at Trent, a genuine mocking smirk, finally breaking through his stoic professional demeanor. He knew exactly who the CEO was, and he knew exactly what I was planning to do to this arrogant man. Our chief executive officer is a very private, very dangerous individual, Darius said, his voice dropping to a chilling register. She does not take phone calls from defaulting clients. However, she is fully aware of your current financial crisis, and she has actually agreed to meet with you in person. Trent blinked, desperate hope briefly flashing across his face. Where, when I will meet her anywhere. She will attend your brother's charity mixed martial arts event this weekend. Look for the woman stepping in the cage. Darius and his executives walked out, leaving Trent alone in the deafening silence. He stared at the penalty invoice resting on the table, his chest heaving with panic. Bleeding cash from every side, his real estate empire crumbling beneath his feet, and he was completely unaware that the company he had just tried to extort was owned by the woman he was trying to force out of his neighborhood. The morning of the official weigh-in and press conference arrived with suffocating humid Georgia heat. While Trent and Hunter were undoubtedly spending their morning primping for the cameras, coordinating their designer outfits, and scripting their arrogant sound bites, I was in the basement of my grandmother's house, systematically reminding my body that it was a weapon. I had spent the last 2 days completely retrofitting the unfinished concrete basement into a high-grade combat conditioning facility. The heavy rhythmic thud of my shins striking the dense leather of a 150-pound Muay Thai heavy bag echoed through the foundation. I wasn't 22 anymore. I didn't have the boundless, foolish adrenaline of a young amateur fighter like Hunter. But what I possessed was something infinitely more dangerous: absolute, unforgiving muscle memory forged in life-or-death combat. Sweat dripped from my chin as I executed a flawless, high-velocity combination jab cross, devastating left hook followed immediately by a brutal knee strike that sent the massive heavy bag swinging violently toward the concrete ceiling. I wasn't training to score points on a judge's scorecard. I was practicing biological dismantling. I visualized the anatomical targets: the fragile cartilage of the trachea, the vulnerable clustering of nerves behind the jawline, the exact angle required to hyperextend a knee joint. Hunter was training for a sporting event with rules and a referee. I was preparing to neutralize an active hostile threat in minimum time. I stepped back, catching my breath, allowing my heart rate to slowly decelerate to a calm, steady rhythm. The encrypted tablet resting on a nearby wooden crate chimed. Marcus's face appeared on the screen, his backdrop the familiar glowing monitors of the Aegis Command Center. Commander, the tactical breakdown of the athletic club is complete. Marcus reported, pulling up a highly detailed 3D wireframe blueprint of the downtown Grand Ballroom where the press conference was being held. I grabbed a towel, wiping the sweat from my face as I approached the screen. Walk me through the perimeter. Trent has rented the entire second floor, Marcus explained, highlighting various sectors of the blueprint in red. He has hired local third-party event security. They are underpaid, undertrained, and primarily focused on crowd control for the VIP sections. There are exactly 4 primary exits, 2 service elevators, and 1 underground loading dock. We have already tapped into the building's closed-circuit television network. I will have full visual oversight of the ballroom from the moment you step out of your vehicle. What is the psychological profile on the ground? I asked, unscrewing a bottle of water. Trent is currently in full crisis mode, Marcus noted, bringing up a split screen showing Trent's corporate headquarters. Since Darius hit him with that $10 million penalty invoice yesterday, Trent's internal communications have been chaotic. He is aggressively bleeding capital and terrified of public exposure. He views this press conference as a desperate PR stunt to project strength to his remaining investors. And Hunter, Marcus scoffed slightly. Hunter is riding a massive ego trip. His social media engagement has spiked since Trent bought that smear piece in the local paper. He genuinely believes you are a broken, out-of-shape civilian. He is going to try and dominate you verbally on stage today to solidify his alpha narrative in front of the cameras. Let him try, I replied coldly. I want Aegis operatives stationed at the service elevators and the loading dock, plain clothes only. If Trent tries to pull a desperate last-minute stunt when the press conference goes sideways, I want absolute control over the exits. Already deployed, Commander, Marcus confirmed. And regarding your wardrobe for the press event, I am not playing his elite social game, I said, tossing the towel aside. I am going as exactly what I am. 2 hours later, I stood in front of the vintage mirror in my bedroom. I bypassed the dresses and tailored suits my mother always demanded I wear to fit in. Instead, I pulled on a pair of pitch-black, highly functional tactical cargo pants and a fitted dark moisture-wicking athletic shirt that discreetly highlighted the dense corded muscle of my shoulders and arms. I pulled my hair back into a severe, tight military braid, ensuring zero loose strands could be grabbed in a close-quarters altercation. I strapped my heavy leather combat boots on, lacing them tightly. I looked into the mirror. There was no trace of the quiet, standoffish neighbor anymore. Only the commander remained. It was time to go to work. Trent had rented out the grand ballroom of Atlanta's most exclusive downtown athletic club for the official weigh-in and press conference. He wanted to guarantee that his brother's victory would be broadcast to the widest possible audience, turning a simple charity fight into a massive media spectacle. Flashbulbs strobed blindly across the raised stage, illuminating the massive promotional banners that plastered the Preston family name across the walls. I sat perfectly still in a basic folding chair behind a long table draped in black velvet. I wore simple, dark athletic wear, my hair pulled back into a tight, practical military braid. The front row of the audience was a sea of arrogant faces. My sister Jada sat sipping sparkling water and whispering catty remarks to her wealthy friends. My mother Evelyn sat 2 seats down from her, wearing a wide, forced smile, looking completely desperate to fit in with the high society crowd. They were all waiting for the main event, eager to watch the outcast of the family be publicly humiliated. The heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open, and Trent Preston marched down the center aisle. However, the usual arrogant swagger was completely missing from his step. His custom-tailored suit looked slightly rumpled, and his face was a pale, sickly shade of gray. He had just rushed over from his corporate headquarters, where my security executives had handed him a $10 million penalty invoice. His real estate empire was currently bleeding cash from every side, and he was desperately scanning the room, looking for the mysterious chief executive officer of Aegis Global, who was supposed to be in attendance. He did not even glance at me sitting on the stage. In his mind, I was just a minor nuisance compared to the massive financial ruin staring him in the face. Trent took his seat in the front row next to Jada, bouncing his knee nervously and constantly checking his encrypted smartphone. He wiped a bead of cold sweat from his forehead, completely unaware that the ruthless executive he was so desperately searching the crowd for was currently sitting just a few feet away, patiently waiting for the trap to spring. The crowd erupted into loud, enthusiastic cheers as loud hip-hop music suddenly blasted through the heavy acoustic speakers. Hunter Preston made his grand entrance surrounded by a massive entourage of trainers, cornermen, and local models. He was completely shirtless, his muscular torso gleaming with baby oil and covered in aggressive tribal tattoos. He paced back and forth across the stage like an agitated zoo animal, flexing his muscles and shadowboxing the empty air. He wore his amateur mixed martial arts championship belt slung over his right shoulder, making sure every sports journalist in the room got a clear, unobstructed photograph of his hardware. He high-fived the wealthy socialites in the front row, eating up the spotlight and basking in the unearned adoration of his brother's elite network. He stepped up to the long velvet table, completely ignoring his designated chair, and chose instead to stand directly in front of the center microphone, dominating the space. Hunter snatched the wireless microphone from the table, pointing a taped, aggressive finger in my direction. "I honestly feel a little bit bad for her," Hunter announced, his voice booming through the ballroom. "Trent told me I need to go easy on the charity case. I mean, look at her. She looks like she belongs behind the counter of a greasy diner, not inside a professional fighting cage." I know you all heard the rumors about her being some kind of tough military veteran, but let us be real here. We all know what women actually do in the army. They push papers, they answer phone calls, they play glorified secretaries while the real men do the actual fighting. A chorus of deep masculine laughter erupted from Trent's section of the audience. Jada actually giggled, covering her mouth with a manicured hand to hide her amusement. Evelyn simply looked down at her lap, refusing to defend her own flesh and blood against the blatant, highly offensive disrespect. Hunter paced closer to my side of the table, emboldened by the cruel laughter of his peers. He leaned over, invading my personal space, his breath smelling faintly of energy drinks and cheap cologne. "This is a man's sport, Sienna," he sneered into the microphone, making sure the cameras caught every angle of his dominating posture. "You should have taken the buyout money my brother offered you at the barbecue. You could have used that cash to buy some decent clothes and learn how to be a real woman. Instead, you are going to get humiliated in front of the entire city. My advice: after I knock you out in the first round, you should go back to the kitchen, bake some pies for my family, and apologize for being such a stubborn, masculine disappointment." The journalists scribbled frantically in their notepads, loving the controversial sound bites. Trent gave his younger brother a proud, validating thumbs up from the front row, momentarily distracted from his impending corporate doom. They were attempting to break me psychologically, using public humiliation and blatant misogyny as weapons to shatter my focus before we ever stepped into the arena. I did not react. I did not frown. I did not scowl. And I certainly did not raise my voice in defensive anger. I sat back in my folding chair, remaining perfectly still as I analyzed the foolish boy standing before me. My elite combat training automatically cataloged his physical tells. Despite his loud bravado, his shoulders were incredibly stiff. His jerky movements burned unnecessary adrenaline. I could see the rapid fluttering pulse beating against his neck. He was not confident. He was a pathetic bully who had always spent his amateur career fighting intimidated opponents. He wanted a screaming match. I was going to give him an absolute nightmare. I slowly stood up from the folding chair, my movements fluid and deliberate, completely devoid of the frantic, nervous energy that Hunter was currently projecting across the stage. I did not rush. I walked toward the center of the platform where he stood, my combat boots making soft, rhythmic thuds against the polished wooden floorboards. The crowd, anticipating a screaming match or a reality television-style confrontation, suddenly fell into an uneasy, breathless hush. My silence was not submission. It was the calculated, predatory calm of a soldier stepping onto an active battlefield. I stopped just 2 feet away from him, easily invading his personal space, refusing to look down or break eye contact. Hunter puffed out his bare chest, trying desperately to maintain his intimidating posture, but I could clearly see the slight involuntary tremor in his hands. Instead of reaching for the wireless microphone, he was clutching like a lifeline or attempting to shout over his ridiculous insults. I reached out and grasped the heavy, solid steel microphone stand resting on the velvet-draped table between us. It was a thick, weighted piece of industrial equipment designed to withstand the heavy wear and tear of massive corporate press conferences. I wrapped my right hand securely around the center of the cold metal shaft. I did not grunt. I did not flex for the flashing cameras or grit my teeth in exertion. With a single smooth application of raw kinetic force, I leaned my body weight into the movement and effortlessly bent the solid steel stand completely in half. The thick metal groaned and warped with a loud, piercing shriek that echoed sharply through the silent ballroom. I tossed the ruined, mangled piece of steel onto the table. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud that made several prominent sports journalists in the front row physically jump in their seats. I stepped even closer to Hunter, forcing him to look directly into my eyes. I did not blink. I let him look past the quiet, unassuming neighbor he thought he knew, and allowed him to finally see the icy, lethal void of a highly trained military commander who had survived horrors he could not even begin to comprehend. The smug, arrogant grin melted off his handsome face in an instant, replaced by a sudden, undeniable flash of genuine terror. "You talk entirely too much, Hunter." I said, my voice dropping to a low, deadpan whisper that was amplified perfectly by the acoustics of the dead silent room. In the combat zones, I commanded loudmouths, who strut around making noise, rarely last more than 3 seconds before they catch a bullet. You think this cage is a war zone because you throw punches for shiny trophies and plastic belts. But I do not fight for points. I fight to eliminate active threats. And looking at you right now, all I see is a very soft, very loud little boy who has never actually had to fight for his life. Hunter's false bravado completely shattered into a million pieces. He literally took a stumbling step backward, desperately putting physical distance between us. A cold sweat immediately broke out across his forehead, gathering in the creases of his aggressive tribal tattoos. The arrogant, swaggering amateur champion from 2 minutes ago was entirely gone. His chest was heaving, but not from athletic exertion. It was the rapid, shallow breathing of prey finally recognizing an apex predator. For the first time in his sheltered, privileged life, he realized he was not stepping into a charity exhibition match with a disgruntled, out-of-shape suburban housewife. He was stepping into a locked cage with a lethal trained killer who had dismantling human bodies committed to permanent muscle memory. The wealthy elite sitting in the front rows were absolutely paralyzed by the display of raw strength and psychological dominance. The journalists had completely stopped taking photographs, their heavy cameras lowering as the thick, oppressive tension in the room suffocated the planned spectacle. Trent Preston sat rigidly in his expensive front-row leather chair, his jaw hanging slightly open in pure disbelief as he stared blankly at the bent steel microphone stand resting on the table. Next to him, my younger sister Jada looked genuinely physically ill. She had foolishly spent her entire life vastly underestimating me, writing me off as a masculine failure, and now she was watching me absolutely dominate a room full of powerful people without even raising my voice. I turned away from Hunter, dismissing his existence entirely. I did not bother to look at my mother Evelyn, who was sitting with her manicured hands, covering her mouth in total shock. She had spent years prioritizing these shallow, status-obsessed people over her own daughter, and now she had to watch her chosen elite cower in fear. I simply walked over to my dark canvas gym bag, slung it casually over my shoulder, and proceeded down the side stairs of the brightly lit stage. The massive crowd parted for me, immediately stepping back quickly to clear a wide, unobstructed path as I moved through the lavish ballroom. No one whispered petty insults. No one threw any mocking remarks about my clothes or my career. They just watched me leave in total fearful silence, finally understanding that they had pushed the wrong woman entirely too far. The press conference was officially over, but the psychological warfare was already decisively won. I walked out of the heavy, glass double doors and stepped directly into the warm, humid Atlanta evening breeze, leaving every single one of them completely trapped inside that ballroom with their own suffocating dread. The highly anticipated charity fight was officially scheduled for this upcoming Saturday night, and I was fully prepared to systematically dismantle their entire fraudulent empire in front of everyone they desperately wanted to impress. I was going to make absolutely sure that when the dust finally settled, they would have absolutely nothing left attached to their pathetic, worthless names. While I was meticulously shifting my mindset into a state of total tactical warfare, my mother and sister were actively indulging in the very delusions that were about to destroy them. Just hours before the main event at the athletic club, Evelyn and Jada were not concerned about the brutal physical reality of the cage fight. They were entirely preoccupied with how they would look in front of the cameras while watching my public downfall. They sat in the VIP lounge of Atlanta's most exclusive and obscenely expensive day spa in the heart of Buckhead. The room smelled of lavender and exorbitant wealth. Jada was lounging in a plush white robe on a heated massage chair, sipping imported French champagne from a crystal flute, while two estheticians worked simultaneously on her manicure and pedicure. Evelyn sat across from her, having a customized diamond dust facial applied by a woman she completely ignored. I still can't believe how incredibly embarrassing she was at the press conference. Evelyn complained, her voice tight to avoid wrinkling her face mask. Bending that microphone stand like some sort of aggressive masculine brute. The socialites in the front row were absolutely horrified, Jada. Margaret Preston looked at me like I had dragged a feral animal into their athletic club. Jada rolled her eyes, admiring the fresh coat of crimson polish on her fingernails. Don't worry about Margaret, Mom. Trent assured me that Hunter is going to completely knock Sienna out in the first 30 seconds. It will be a definitive end to this entire ridiculous drama. Once she loses, she legally forfeits that rotting house to Trent, and we can finally wipe our hands of her entirely. Evelyn sighed in relief, waving her hand to dismiss the esthetician who was applying her facial. Thank God. I am so exhausted from trying to apologize for her existence to your husband's network. After tonight, we are officially cutting her off. If she ends up on the streets, that is her own fault for dropping out of medical school. Exactly. Jada agreed, taking a long sip of her champagne. Oh, by the way, I stopped by the boutique on Fifth Avenue this morning. I bought that stunning backless emerald gown to wear ringside tonight. The paparazzi are going to be everywhere, and I need to look flawless for the victory party Trent is hosting afterward. How much was the gown, darling? Evelyn asked, eyes gleaming with vicarious pride at her daughter's spending power. 15,000, Jada said casually, as if she were discussing the price of a cup of coffee. I just put it on Trent's black card. He has been a little stressed about his construction budgets lately, but he always says, image is the most important investment we can make. Neither of them had any idea that the black credit card Jada had so casually swiped that morning was secretly backed by the stolen pension funds of elderly minority workers. They had no idea that the luxury spa they were lounging in, the expensive champagne they were drinking, and the designer clothes they were preparing to parade around in were entirely funded by a crumbling, fraudulent Ponzi scheme that was hours away from total federal exposure. You deserve it, sweetie. Evelyn cooed, smiling warmly at her youngest daughter. You married into true class. Tonight we will sit in the front row, we will smile for the cameras, and we will finally close the dark, embarrassing chapter of Sienna in our lives forever. They raised their crystal flutes and clinked them together in a toast to their own perceived superiority. They were entirely blissfully ignorant of the fact that the federal warrants for their complete destruction were already being signed, sealed, and prepared for immediate delivery. I retreated to the private staging room my security team had secured deep within the bowels of the athletic club. The heavy concrete walls provided a temporary buffer from the chaotic energy vibrating through the arena above. I needed a few moments of absolute solitude to shift my mindset from corporate strategist back to combat operator. I sat on a solid wooden bench in the center of the sterile room, unzipping my dark canvas gym bag. As I looked down at the rolls of athletic tape, my mind drifted away from the sterile concrete walls of the athletic club and traveled back to the worn floral-patterned armchair in my grandmother's living room. To the wealthy elites sitting up in the VIP section, that property was just a dilapidated shack, an ugly blemish on their manicured suburban landscape that needed to be bulldozed for a putting green. To my mother, Evelyn, it was an embarrassing reminder of her working-class roots, a history she had spent her entire adult life desperately trying to erase with leased luxury cars and fake designer handbags. But to me, that house was the only true sanctuary I had ever known. My grandmother. Clara didn't have a trust fund or a real estate empire. She had calloused hands and an unbreakable spine. When my grandfather died unexpectedly, leaving her with a mountain of medical debt and two young daughters, she didn't complain. She worked a morning shift at a commercial bakery, an afternoon shift cleaning houses in the very same wealthy neighborhoods that Trent now claimed to own, and took in sewing alterations on the weekends. She paid off her mortgage dollar by hard-earned dollar, sacrificing her own comfort so that our family would always have a permanent roof over our heads. It wasn't a mansion, but the foundation was built on pure, unadulterated grit. When I was 19, sitting at her small kitchen table and terrified to tell my mother that I was dropping out of pre-med to enlist in the military, Grandma Clara was the only one who didn't look at me with disappointment. I remember her pouring me a glass of sweet tea, her wrinkled hands resting over mine. Evelyn had spent weeks screaming that I was ruining the family's social trajectory, but Grandma just looked me dead in the eye and said, "You have a warrior's spirit, Sienna. Don't let people who have never fought a day in their lives tell you how to wear your armor." She was the only person who wrote to me during my first brutal deployment to Afghanistan, while my mother was busy pretending I didn't exist to her country club friends. Grandma sent me handwritten letters and care packages that smelled like her lavender laundry detergent, keeping me tethered to my humanity when the combat zones threatened to strip it entirely away. She left the house to me in her will because she knew I was the only one who would fiercely protect its history. She knew Evelyn would immediately sell it to buy proximity to the rich, and she knew Jada would flatten it without a second thought. Sitting in the locker room, I realized that tonight wasn't just about putting an arrogant amateur fighter in his place. It was about defending the legacy of a woman who had worked her fingers to the bone against a family of vultures who wanted to pave over her memory for a few yards of artificial turf. I wasn't just fighting for my property, I was fighting to eradicate the parasitic rot that had infected my family tree. I pulled out 2 rolls of professional-grade athletic tape. I began the familiar methodical process of wrapping my bare hands for a fight. I started with my left wrist securing the anchor before weaving the white cotton tape carefully between my fingers. The tight, restrictive pressure against my knuckles felt incredibly grounding. It was a ritual I had performed countless times in the sweltering heat of overseas forward operating bases. Every precise loop of the tape helped quiet the ambient noise in my head, narrowing my entire focus down to the singular, immediate objective. I was not just preparing for a physical fight against a spoiled amateur champion. I was preparing to completely dismantle a massive, incredibly destructive, and highly fraudulent financial empire. As I pulled the tape tight across my right palm, a sharp double click echoed softly inside my right ear. I had inserted a micro-communication earpiece before leaving my grandmother's house that morning. It was a custom-built military-grade device, virtually invisible to the naked eye, and directly linked to the encrypted servers at my corporate headquarters. A smooth, synthesized tone chimed in my ear, followed immediately by the crisp voice of Marcus, the lead director of the Aegis Global Cyber Intelligence Division. "Commander, do you have a secure channel?" Marcus asked, his tone radiating urgent, cold professionalism. "The channel is secure," I replied, speaking quietly into the empty locker room. "Talk to me, Marcus. Tell me you finally cracked the offshore accounts." "We did much more than that," Marcus stated. "The financial firewall surrounding Preston Real Estate Holdings was sophisticated, but Trent left a massive digital trail of breadcrumbs. We initiated the brute force decryption protocols exactly when he panicked and tried to cancel our security contract. While his internal networks were chaotic, our cyber division successfully breached his primary accounting servers. We have secured the entire payload, Commander. It is vastly worse than we originally projected." I paused, my hand wrapping, staring blankly at the solid concrete wall. "Give me the executive summary. What exactly is Trent hiding behind his luxury golf courses and upscale high-rises?" "It is a textbook Ponzi scheme," Marcus explained, his voice tight with controlled disgust. "Trent Preston is not a successful real estate mogul. He is a prolific, systematic fraud. His construction projects have been hemorrhaging money for years due to gross mismanagement and extreme personal embezzlement. He has been funding his lavish lifestyle, buying expensive cars, throwing massive neighborhood barbecues, and purchasing luxury watches, using stolen investment capital entirely. He is using the capital invested by his newest clients to pay off the dividends of his oldest clients," Marcus continued. "A house of cards," I muttered, finishing the final wrap around my right wrist and tearing the tape perfectly with my teeth. That explains why my mother leveraging my grandmother's property was so critical to him. He desperately needed that immediate injection of cash to keep the entire fraudulent structure from completely collapsing in on itself. "Exactly," Marcus confirmed. "But the source of his newly acquired capital is what truly makes this an incredibly horrific major federal crime, Commander. Trent did not just defraud wealthy corporate investors who can absorb the financial hit," Marcus stated. "He specifically targeted vulnerable working-class minority communities. We traced a massive influx of unauthorized wire transfers directly into his private holding accounts. He embezzled millions of dollars from local community-based pension funds. He set up dummy shell corporations to drain the retirement accounts of hundreds of elderly black citizens across the greater Atlanta area. A cold, dangerous fury ignited in the center of my chest. I thought about the arrogant, entitled. Trent had spoken to me on my grandmother's patio recently. He had sneered at my family's history while actively stealing from people just like her. Identify the specific pension funds, I ordered, my voice dropping to a lethal register. Who exactly did he steal from? The largest financial cluster was drained from the Regional Baptist Community Coalition, Marcus replied. I cross-referenced the victim registry against your personal background files. Evelyn's congregation is on the list. Trent completely liquidated the retirement savings of your mother's own church friends. The very same women she plays cards with on Sunday afternoons are currently bankrupt, and they do not even know it yet. He stole their entire life savings to fund the expansion of his private golf course, Marcus said. I slowly stood up from the wooden bench, clenching my freshly taped hands into tight fists. The sheer, unadulterated evil of his actions was staggering. My mother had spent years desperately trying to win Trent's approval. She had scolded me, degraded my military service, and attempted to force me out of my own home just to protect her proximity to his perceived white wealth. She had mortgaged her own mother's house to support a man who was actively robbing her oldest friends blind. Do you have undeniable proof? I asked, pacing across the room. I want bank routing numbers, forged digital signatures, and direct wire transfer receipts. We have everything, Marcus assured me. The digital dossier is fully compiled, verified, and ready for immediate deployment. I have already bypassed the internal audiovisual network of the athletic club. Our tech division currently has complete undetected control over the massive jumbotron hanging directly above the fighting cage. The ultimate weapon is absolutely locked and loaded. We are just waiting for your final green light to initiate the broadcast and completely destroy his fraudulent legacy today. Hold the payload on standby, Marcus, I instructed into the earpiece. Do not execute the broadcast until I give the signal from the center of the cage. I want them to lose their pride before they lose their empire. Marcus confirmed, and the earpiece went silent. I grabbed my custom mouthguard, slipped it into place, and walked out of the staging room. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind me, unleashing the combat operator. The walk down the dark tunnel leading to the arena floor felt like the final approach to a hostile target. The muffled roar of the crowd grew louder with every step. As I emerged into the blinding glare of the stadium lights, the sheer scale of Trent Preston's vanity project became apparent. He transformed the arena into a monument to his fragile ego. High-definition screens suspended from the ceiling broadcast his company logo on a continuous loop. The arena was packed shoulder to shoulder with Atlanta's wealthiest elite. These were the politicians, developers, and socialites who thrived on the systematic exploitation of people they deemed beneath them. Sitting dead center in the prime VIP section was my family. Trent sat with his arms crossed, trying to project untouchable confidence, despite the massive financial hemorrhage secretly draining his accounts. Jada wore a stunning designer dress, sipping champagne and sneering openly as I walked down the aisle. My mother Evelyn sat rigidly on the other side of Trent, chatting with the wealthy women next to her, completely abandoning any maternal instinct in favor of social climbing. They all looked at me like I was a lamb walking into a slaughterhouse. They expected a public execution. Inside the cage, Hunter was putting on a theatrical show for his wealthy audience. He bounced aggressively on his toes, throwing flashy combinations into the empty air. He pounded his gloved fists against his chest and roared at the crowd, soaking up the thunderous cheers of Trent's country club friends. He looked massive under the bright stadium lights, his muscles pumped full of adrenaline and unearned arrogance. I stepped through the cage door, my bare feet sinking slightly into the padded canvas mat. The referee, a seasoned professional who looked nervous about the obvious physical disparity between the two fighters, called us to the center of the octagon. Hunter strutted, refusing to touch gloves. He glared down at me, his eyes wide and manic, completely forgetting the pure terror he had experienced during our previous confrontation at the press conference. Surrounded by his cheering enablers, he had convinced himself my strength was a fluke. I am going to put you to sleep right now. Hunter sneered, his mouthpiece distorting his arrogant threat. I hope you brought the deed to your house. I did not respond. I held his gaze with the cold, unblinking stare of a soldier waiting for the order to fire. The referee gave the final instructions, stepped backward, and signaled for the timekeeper to start the clock. The sharp ring of the bell echoed through the massive arena. The crowd erupted into a deafening, bloodthirsty roar. Hunter did not hesitate for a single second. He charged forward with reckless, explosive aggression, throwing a massive, looping overhand right aimed directly at my jaw. He wanted a spectacular one-punch knockout to immortalize his victory on camera. It was a sloppy, predictable, entirely amateurish strike fueled by pure ego rather than tactical discipline. There was no drawn-out, dramatic back-and-forth exchange. I did not raise my hands to block his heavy punch, and I certainly did not retreat against the chain-link fence. Instead, I stepped directly inside the arc of his swinging arm, utilizing a brutal, highly advanced form of close-quarters combat. I slipped my head past his fist, feeling the rush of air as his glove missed my face. Simultaneously, I drove my left forearm hard into his exposed throat, disrupting his forward momentum and violently snapping his head backward. Before Hunter could even process the blinding pain in his airway, I pivoted my hips and executed a devastating leg sweep. Hunter's feet were completely ripped out from under him. He crashed onto the canvas mat with a sickening, heavy thud that knocked the oxygen entirely out of his lungs. He was disoriented, gasping for air, and frantically trying to scramble back to his feet. I did not give him the chance. I transitioned my weight, dropping my knee squarely onto his lower back to pin him. With ruthless clinical efficiency, I snaked my right arm under his chin, locked my bicep tightly against his carotid artery, and secured a flawless, inescapable rear naked chokehold. I clamped my hands together and squeezed with the crushing pressure of a hydraulic vise. Hunter panicked immediately. His eyes bulged in pure, suffocating terror as the blood flow to his brain was instantly severed. He thrashed his legs wildly against the canvas, desperately clawing at my locked arms, but my grip was absolute iron. The arrogant champion realized he was completely trapped in a vice he could not break. His desperate thrashing slowed within seconds as the darkness rapidly closed in on his vision. Hunter slapped his open palm frantically against the mat in a humiliating plea for mercy. Tap, tap, tap. The referee lunged forward immediately, frantically waving his hands in the air and physically pulling on my shoulder to force me to break the submission hold. I released my grip, instantly standing up and slowly stepping away from the gasping, completely defeated man who was currently writhing on the cold arena floor. I calmly looked up at the glowing red digital clock that was suspended high above the dead center of the fighting cage. The total elapsed time from the opening bell was exactly 12 seconds. The deafening, bloodthirsty roar of the cheering crowd had completely and permanently vanished. The massive sold-out athletic arena went absolutely terrifyingly dead silent as the ultimate truth dawned on them. The heavy, suffocating silence inside the arena lasted for exactly 3 seconds before pure, unadulterated chaos erupted. The wealthy spectators sitting in the front rows leaped out of their expensive folding chairs, their mouths hanging open in total disbelief. They had paid premium ticket prices to watch a highly anticipated spectacle of my public humiliation. Instead, they had witnessed their golden boy get systematically dismantled and choked into unconsciousness faster than they could take a sip of their overpriced cocktails. A low murmur of shock began to ripple through the crowd, quickly building into a wave of panicked shouting. The referee was still kneeling on the canvas, checking Hunter's vital signs and waving for the ringside medical team to enter the cage. I stood perfectly still near the center of the octagon, my breathing steady and controlled, watching the fallout of my precise tactical strike. Suddenly, a sharp, furious scream shattered the rising noise of the crowd. Trent Preston violently shoved his way past the ringside photographers, his face contorted into an ugly, beet-red mask of absolute rage. He scrambled up the metal steps of the octagon, pushing a medical technician roughly aside as he tore the cage door off its hinges. He did not rush to check on his unconscious brother lying motionless on the mat. He marched directly toward me, his expensive tailored suit jacket flapping wildly, his finger pointing aggressively at my face. He looked like a man whose carefully constructed reality had just been violently ripped apart, desperately searching for someone to blame for the catastrophic destruction of his massive, fragile ego. "You cheated!" Trent roared, his voice cracking with hysterical panic. He stopped just outside of my striking range, clearly too terrified to actually close the physical distance between us after what he had just witnessed. "There is absolutely no way you did that legally. You used some kind of illegal banned military move. This entire match is invalid, and that contract is completely null and void. Do you hear me? The deal is officially cancelled. I will not surrender a single dime of my estate to a common thug who fights dirty." I did not flinch. I slowly uncurled my taped hands, letting my arms rest casually at my sides. I executed a standard legal takedown followed by a regulation rear naked chokehold. I stated, my voice projecting a cold, unwavering authority. There was no eye gouging, no striking to the back of the head, and no illegal joint manipulation. The referee watched the entire sequence from 2 feet away. Your brother simply stepped into a fight he was completely unqualified to participate in, and he paid the immediate, inevitable price for his staggering arrogance. Before Trent could scream another frantic accusation, 2 more figures pushed their way to the outer edge of the chain-link fence. My mother Evelyn and my sister Jada clung to the black vinyl padding of the cage, their faces pale and horrified. They had banked their entire social standing on my destruction, and now they were staring at the smoldering wreckage of their elite reputation. They could not accept that the woman they had labeled a failure had just dominated their world. "You are a complete psychopath, Sienna!" Jada shrieked through the chain-link fence, her manicured fingers gripping the metal wire so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You deliberately tried to kill him. You came here tonight just to humiliate Trent and ruin our family in front of the entire city. You are an absolute disgrace to this family, and you belong locked up in a psychiatric ward, not living in a civilized neighborhood." Evelyn nodded furiously, tears of profound embarrassment streaming down her cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. She looked at me with an expression of pure, unmasked hatred. "I told you to forfeit," my mother yelled, her voice trembling with desperation. "I begged you to walk away from this fight, but you had to be a stubborn brute. You have ruined everything I have worked so hard to build for this family. You are a monster, Sienna. A violent, uncontrollable monster who destroys everything she touches." I looked at the 3 of them, feeling a deep, quiet sense of finality. The last remaining threads of familial obligation dissolved into dust. They were not my family. They were desperate parasites clinging to a sinking ship. Trent, realizing that his screaming was not changing the outcome of the match or invalidating our legal contract, suddenly pivoted his strategy. He turned away from me and frantically waved his arms toward the outer perimeter of the arena floor, where dozens of massive event security guards were stationed in their dark, tailored uniforms. "Security, get in here right now," Trent ordered, utilizing his loudest, most entitled corporate command voice. He pointed an accusatory finger back at me. "I want this woman arrested immediately for aggravated assault and attempted murder. She intentionally tried to kill an unarmed civilian in a charity exhibition. She is a highly dangerous, unstable veteran who just committed a violent felony in front of 1,000 witnesses. I demand that you put her in handcuffs this exact second to save my family from further humiliation." The wealthy spectators in the front rows began to murmur in agreement, fully supporting Trent's hysterical narrative. They wanted me punished for daring to disrupt their established social hierarchy. They wanted the fierce black man who had just effortlessly dismantled their prized golden boy to be dragged out of the arena in heavy metal chains. Trent stood with his chest puffed out, breathing heavily, completely convinced that his immense wealth and social influence would immediately force the hired help to do his dirty work. He expected the security team to rush the cage, tackle me to the canvas, and drag me away, effectively erasing his humiliating defeat and saving his precious corporate empire from my financial grasp. He had absolutely no earthly idea what terrible fate was rapidly approaching him now. The heavy steel hinges of the octagon groaned as 20 heavily armored security guards marched down the center aisle. They moved in perfect tactical unison, their dark uniforms blending into a formidable wall of muscle and authority. The wealthy spectators in the front rows actively cheered, parting like the Red Sea to let the men pass. Trent stood at the edge of the cage, his chest puffed out with arrogant triumph. He pointed a manicured finger directly at my face, shouting aggressive commands at the approaching squad to put me in handcuffs immediately. My sister Jada clapped her hands together, a vicious smile stretching across her face as she anticipated my public arrest. My mother Evelyn nodded in fervent agreement, completely blinded by her desperate loyalty to Trent's crumbling empire. The security team reached the metal steps of the cage. They did not rush. They filed into the octagon with terrifying precision, fanning out to form a solid perimeter around the canvas mat. Trent stepped back, crossing his arms, waiting for the violent takedown he believed his money had just purchased. The arena held its collective breath, anticipating the final destruction of the unruly veteran who had dared to disrupt their elite social hierarchy. I stood in the exact center of the blood-stained canvas, completely relaxed. I did not raise my hands in surrender, and I did not assume a defensive stance. The lead security executive, Darius, stepped through the open cage door. He ignored Trent entirely. He walked past the unconscious, groaning body of Hunter Preston still lying on the mat. Darius stopped exactly 3 feet in front of me. The massive, imposing man did not reach for a pair of handcuffs. Instead, he snapped his combat boots together with a sharp, resounding crack that echoed through the silent stadium. He straightened his spine into flawless military posture. The 19 other heavily armed guards surrounding the cage immediately mirrored his movements. In perfect, thunderous synchronization, 20 elite tactical operatives snapped sharp, rigid salutes and shouted at the top of their lungs, "Yes, Commander!" The booming voices shook the very foundation of the athletic club. The wealthy crowd gasped in collective shock. Trent's arrogant smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a look of profound, paralyzing confusion. He looked from Darius to the perimeter guards, frantically waving his arms in the air. "What are you doing?" Trent shrieked, his voice cracking under the immense pressure. "I pay your corporate retainer. I gave you a direct order to arrest this woman for aggravated assault. Put her in chains right now." Darius slowly lowered his hand from his salute. He turned his head just slightly to look at Trent, a cold, mocking smile playing on his lips. "You do not pay our retainer anymore, Mr. Preston," Darius stated calmly. "And you certainly do not have the authority to issue orders to the supreme commander of this organization." I held out my right hand. Without missing a beat, Darius reached into his tactical vest, pulled out a sleek wireless microphone, and placed it respectfully into my palm. I stepped forward, the bright stadium lights reflecting off the sweat on my shoulders. I looked down at Trent, who was now trembling uncontrollably at the edge of the cage. "Allow me to formally introduce myself, Trent," I said, my voice projecting crystal clear through the massive acoustic speakers overhead. "My name is Sienna. I am a former commanding officer of the 75th Ranger Regiment. I am also the sole founder, primary shareholder, and active chief executive officer of Aegis Global. The men you just tried to order around are not your personal attack dogs. They are my highly trained, highly compensated employees. You are currently standing in a cage secured by my company, demanding that my own tactical division arrest me for winning a sanctioned athletic wager that you willingly signed." Trent physically recoiled as if he had been struck by lightning. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent white. His eyes darted wildly between me, Darius, and the solid wall of Aegis operatives standing guard. The catastrophic reality of his situation crashed down upon him with the weight of a collapsing skyscraper. He had just spent the entire morning screaming at my executives in his corporate boardroom, trying to extort my company for cash, and illegally incurring a $10 million breach of contract penalty. Now he was trapped in a cage with me, owing me his entire residential estate from the fight wager, while simultaneously owing my corporation a massive financial penalty he could never possibly pay. He had single-handedly handed me the absolute power to legally and financially obliterate his entire existence. Down in the front row, Jada dropped her expensive glass of sparkling water. It shattered against the concrete floor, the sharp sound cutting through the stunned silence of the elite crowd. Her jaw hung open as she stared at the sister she had spent years mocking as a broke masculine failure. Evelyn clutched the collar of her designer blouse, her eyes wide with mounting horror. She had sacrificed her own flesh and blood to worship at the altar of Trent's perceived wealth, only to discover that her discarded daughter was the actual billionaire pulling all the strings. I watched the profound, inescapable terror wash over Trent's face. He could not speak. He could not run. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his own fatal arrogance. The crowd remained frozen, collectively holding their breath as they witnessed the total destruction of a man they had previously idolized. My security team stood perfectly still, their expressions completely unreadable, projecting an intimidating aura of absolute loyalty and discipline. I raised the microphone back to my lips, ready to deliver the final devastating blow. The grand illusion was shattered, and the ultimate reckoning had finally arrived for the corrupt family standing before me. This was absolute justice. The final absolute and complete destruction awaited him. I raised my left hand, two fingers extended toward the ceiling. Deep within the secure underground staging room, I knew Marcus and his elite cyber intelligence division were waiting for that exact gesture. I brought my fingers down in a swift, sharp chopping motion. High above the center of the octagon, the massive high-definition jumbotron flickered. The delayed replay of Hunter collapsing onto the canvas vanished, replaced by a momentary screen of pure static black. A collective gasp echoed through the crowded VIP section as the stadium lights dimmed, plunging the arena into a heavy shadow. The only illumination came from the colossal screens directly above us. A highly classified, heavily encrypted file directory appeared, scrolling rapidly through dense lines of green code before locking firmly onto a master folder boldly titled with Trent Preston's full legal name. You built your entire reputation on the illusion of unshakable wealth, I announced into the microphone, my voice slicing through the dark arena. You paraded around Buckhead acting like a self-made titan of real estate, tearing down historic homes to build your private golf courses. But real wealth leaves a clean paper trail. Yours is covered in dirt, desperation, and federal felonies. On the Jumbotron, a series of international banking documents flashed onto the screen. They were offshore account statements from the Cayman Islands and Switzerland, showing massive, frantic wire transfers of liquid cash. The numbers were highlighted in accusatory red. I walked slowly around the cage, making sure Trent could not look away from his own financial execution. These are your personal ledgers, Trent. They prove your entire real estate empire is nothing but a leveraged Ponzi scheme. You have not turned a profit in over 4.5 years. Trent stumbled backward against the rigid chain-link fence, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly as his deepest, darkest secrets were broadcast in vivid high definition to absolutely everyone he knew. Down in the front row, Jada stood up abruptly, her hands trembling violently as she stared blankly at the glaring screen. I shifted my cold gaze directly to my younger sister, offering her zero sympathy for her current predicament. Did you really think he married you for your sophisticated charm? Jada? I asked, my voice echoing mercilessly across the room. The Jumbotron swiftly cycled to a brand new set of damning corporate documents. Look very closely at the distinct signatures on those offshore shell corporations. Look at the specific names actively registered to those massive defaulting loans. Jada let out a piercing, horrified scream as she instantly recognized her own handwriting. Trent did not just use you as a trophy wife to impress his friends. He used you as a disposable legal human shield. He forged your digital signature on over $40 million of illegal, completely unsecured debt. When the federal government inevitably seizes this fake empire, you are the one legally positioned to take the absolute fall and go straight to federal prison, not him. Jada dropped heavily to her knees, frantically clutching her head, as the luxurious reality she had blindly worshipped shattered completely into dust. But I was definitely not finished. The most unforgivable, truly despicable crime had yet to be fully exposed to the public. I turned my undivided attention to my mother, Evelyn. She was standing frozen like a statue, her eyes wide with mounting terror as the digital screens above shifted once again. This time, the financial documents were domestic. They were routing numbers and detailed pension fund statements directly from local community based organizations. You spent my entire life repeatedly telling me that I was a massive failure because I did not comfortably fit into this elite, wealthy white society you so desperately craved, I said directly to my terrified mother. You willingly mortgaged your own mother's historic home to fiercely protect this manipulative man. You wanted to be close to his perceived wealth so badly that you never once bothered to ask where that money was actually coming from. The Jumbotron aggressively zoomed in on a specific devastating wire transfer receipt. Read the name of the victimized account, Mother, I commanded, leaving no room for argument. Evelyn squinted at the massive screen, and I watched the exact moment her heart stopped beating. That is the Regional Baptist Community Coalition Pension Fund, I stated clearly and concisely. That is the lifelong retirement savings of your own devoted church congregation. The very same women you play cards with on Sunday afternoons. The loyal women you tried so hard to impress with your expensive new clothes and leased luxury cars are currently completely bankrupt because of your favorite son-in-law. Trent systematically embezzled millions of dollars directly from the elderly black community to illegally fund his fast sports cars, his custom Italian suits, and his aggressive private golf course expansion. To permanently solidify his utter destruction, I immediately signaled Marcus for the final critical piece of the digital payload. A crisp, highly enhanced audio recording played directly through the stadium's surround sound speakers. It was a verified wiretap of Trent speaking candidly to a shady offshore investor just 2 days prior. Trent's arrogant, sneering voice filled the arena, complaining about how incredibly easy it was to steal from the naive, elderly minorities in his wife's local community, openly bragging that they were far too uneducated to ever notice the missing funds. The raw, unfiltered racism and predatory malice present in his own unmistakable voice removed any remaining shadow of a doubt. The wealthy investors in the crowd, many of whom had eagerly given Trent millions of dollars for his fraudulent construction projects, suddenly erupted into furious, panicked shouting. They realized their money was completely gone, stolen by the very man standing trapped inside the cage. Trent fell to his knees on the canvas, clutching his chest as he hyperventilated. His brother remained unconscious. He looked up terrified, finally realizing I had meticulously orchestrated his total and completely inescapable financial ruin. The blinding stadium lights beat down on the octagon as the absolute reality of Trent Preston's total destruction finally settled over the roaring crowd. Before the corrupt real estate developer could even attempt to scramble to his feet and formulate a pathetic excuse, a piercing, high-pitched wail shattered the remaining tension in the room. The deafening sound of dozens of heavy police sirens echoed loudly outside the downtown athletic club. The flashing red and blue emergency lights violently reflected off the massive glass double doors at the main entrance, casting an eerie, frantic strobe effect across the faces of the panicked, wealthy elite. I did not move a single muscle. I just stood in the center of the cage, my hands resting comfortably at my sides, watching the flawless execution of my tactical trap. My cyber intelligence director, Marcus, had forwarded the entire digital payload to the federal authorities hours ago. The FBI had simply been waiting on standby outside the building, drinking coffee in their unmarked vans, waiting for my signal to move in and clean up the mess. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom burst open with explosive force. Over 30 armed federal agents wearing dark tactical vests, emblazoned with the bright yellow FBI logo, swarmed into the massive venue. They moved with absolute terrifying authority, barking sharp commands that instantly silenced the chaotic screaming investors in the front rows. The agents did not waste time navigating the confused crowd. They marched directly down the center aisle, their boots thudding heavily against the polished wooden floorboards. The private event security guards Trent had hired instantly backed away, throwing their hands in the air and wanting absolutely no part of the federal raid. My own Aegis operatives remained perfectly still, holding the perimeter of the cage with stoic discipline as the federal agents rapidly ascended the metal stairs and flooded into the octagon. Trent remained on his knees, his expensive custom-tailored suit completely soaked in cold, terrified sweat. He looked up at the lead federal agent, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "There is a massive misunderstanding here," Trent stammered, his voice cracking into a high, hysterical pitch. "I am a prominent developer. I have friends in the mayor's office. You cannot just barge in here. That woman hacked my private servers and fabricated those documents on the screen." The lead agent did not even bother to entertain his frantic, desperate lies. He reached into his tactical vest, pulled out a thick stack of folded legal warrants, and shoved them aggressively against Trent's chest. "Trent Preston, you are under arrest for massive wire fraud, grand larceny, and federal racketeering. Put your hands behind your back right now, or we will put you face down on this mat and do it for you." Trent let out a strangled, pathetic sob as two burly agents grabbed his arms, twisting them roughly behind his back. The sharp, heavy click of solid steel handcuffs echoing over the stadium microphones was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. Right beside him, the amateur mixed martial arts champion was finally starting to regain consciousness. Hunter Preston groaned, his eyes fluttering open as the lingering effects of my rear-naked chokehold slowly wore off. He blinked in total confusion, staring up at the bright stadium lights, only to find three federal agents standing directly over him with their weapons drawn. "Get up!" an agent barked, hauling the massive tattooed fighter to his bare feet. "Hunter Preston, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud and accessory to grand larceny. Hands behind your back." The realization of his impending prison sentence hit the arrogant champion like a runaway freight train. Hunter completely broke down. The tough, aggressive fighter who had mocked my military service and told me to go back to the kitchen just 20 minutes ago was now openly weeping in the center of the cage. Heavy tears streamed down his face, mixing with his sweat and baby oil. He sobbed uncontrollably like a terrified child, begging the federal agents to let him call his lawyer. The sports journalists surrounding the cage did not offer any sympathy. They frantically snapped thousands of high-definition photographs, ensuring that the pathetic crying faces of the Preston brothers would be plastered across the front page of every major national news outlet by morning. Down in the VIP section, the social dynamics were violently imploding. Trent and Hunter's wealthy parents, a pair of elite status-obsessed socialites who had spent their entire lives looking down on minority communities, were watching their pristine family legacy burn to the ground. Their faces were stark white with pure, unadulterated horror. As the federal agents dragged their two sobbing, handcuffed sons out of the fighting cage, Jada turned to her in-laws for desperate support. My younger sister was trembling violently, tears ruining her expensive makeup as she reached out to grab her mother-in-law's manicured hand. "Margaret, please," Jada pleaded, her voice choked with hysterical panic. "You have to help me. Trent forged my name on those loans. I did not know anything about the stolen pension funds. You have to tell the police that I am innocent." Margaret Preston snatched her hand away, as if Jada's skin was covered in a deadly infectious disease. She took a massive step backward, her face contorting into a vicious, hateful sneer. She did not see a daughter-in-law in distress. She saw a convenient, expendable scapegoat to absorb the catastrophic fallout of her son's horrific crimes. "Do not you dare touch me, you pathetic little gold digger," Margaret hissed, her voice dripping with blatant, undeniable racism and pure malice. "My boys were running a perfectly legitimate business before you and your family ruined everything. We never actually approved of your classless people." Jada gasped, staggering backwards. The father-in-law violently shoved her away, abandoning her completely without a second thought forever. The justice system is a painfully slow machine for the working class, but when federal authorities uncover a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme, defrauding massive pension funds, the wheels turn with blinding, terrifying speed. At 9:00 a.m. on Monday morning, the Richard B. Russell Federal Building in downtown Atlanta was swarmed by a media circus. News vans blocked the streets, and aggressive reporters elbowed each other on the courthouse steps. I didn't have to push through the crowd. My Aegis security detail escorted me quietly through a secure side entrance, granting me access to the heavy oak benches of the courtroom gallery before the public was allowed inside. I wore a sharp-tailored black suit, sitting in the back row with perfect posture, completely unbothered. I wanted to look Trent Preston in the eye when he finally understood that his life was over. The heavy side door of the courtroom swung open, and the bailiff led the defendants in. The collective gasp from the few reporters who had managed to secure a seat was audible. Trent and Hunter Preston were practically unrecognizable. The custom Italian suits, the expensive watches, and the arrogant, entitled swagger were completely gone. They were dressed in standard-issue shapeless orange jumpsuits. Their wrists and ankles were bound by heavy steel chains that clanked loudly against the polished floorboards, echoing the exact same sound of the chains their hired thugs had brought to my porch just a few nights prior. Trent's face was sunken, his skin pale and greasy. He looked like a man who hadn't slept a single second since the FBI dragged him out of the octagon. Hunter walked behind him, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped in total defeat, still sporting the deep purple bruising around his neck from my chokehold. When they took their seats at the defense table, Trent immediately looked toward the gallery, his bloodshot eyes scanning the room in a state of wild panic. He was looking for his high-priced, shark-like corporate defense attorneys. He was looking for the men he paid thousands of dollars an hour to make his legal problems disappear. Instead, a young, visibly exhausted public defender approached their table carrying a massive stack of manila folders. Trent practically leaped out of his chair, the chains rattling violently. "Who the hell are you?" he hissed loud enough for the gallery to hear. "Where is my lead counsel? Where is Harrison? I demanded my firm represent me." The public defender sighed, looking at Trent with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Mr. Preston, please sit down. Your private firm officially dropped you as a client yesterday afternoon. Because your entire estate is currently frozen by federal marshals, and because a private security corporation called Aegis Global legally acquired and called in all of your outstanding massive debts, your bank accounts are entirely overdrawn. You have absolutely zero liquid assets to retain private counsel. I was assigned to your case by the state at 6 o'clock this morning." Trent swayed on his feet, the color draining from his face as the absolute reality of my trap finally clicked into place. I had not just ruined his reputation. By purchasing his debt through the Apex credit buyout, I had systematically stripped him of the financial armor required to defend himself in a court of law. He was completely broke, facing federal prosecutors with a public defender who hadn't even had time to read his case file. Trent slowly turned his head, looking past the wooden barrier. His eyes locked onto mine in the back row. I didn't smile. I didn't sneer. I just tilted my head slightly, offering him a single, slow, deliberate nod of acknowledgement. It was the cold recognition of a commander confirming a kill. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed as the federal judge entered the courtroom. The hearing was brutally short. The lead federal prosecutor, armed with the undeniable, highly encrypted digital dossier Marcus had provided, didn't hold back. She outlined a staggering conspiracy of wire fraud, grand larceny, and the systematic exploitation of vulnerable elderly communities. When it came time to discuss bail, the prosecutor was merciless. "Your Honor, the defendants are facing a combined 85 years in federal prison. Given the sheer scale of the fraud, the international offshore accounts involved, and the extreme flight risk, the state vehemently requests that bail be denied in its entirety." Trent's public defender weakly attempted to argue for a house arrest monitor, but he had absolutely no ammunition. The judge, a stern woman with zero patience for white-collar predators, slammed her gavel down with finality. "Bail is unequivocally denied," the judge announced, her voice echoing through the silent courtroom. "The defendants will be remanded to the custody of the federal penitentiary system pending trial. This court is adjourned." Trent's knees buckled. If the bailiffs hadn't caught him by his arms, he would have collapsed onto the courtroom floor. Hunter began to quietly sob again, shuffling toward the holding cell door like a broken dog. As they were dragged out of the courtroom, Trent cast one final desperate look over his shoulder. The arrogant real estate mogul who had tried to steal my grandmother's legacy was gone, replaced by a terrified, destitute prisoner who finally realized he had picked a fight with a woman who owned the very ground he walked on. I stood up, buttoned my suit jacket, and walked out of the courthouse, stepping out into the bright, blinding Atlanta sunshine. The fallout over the next 72 hours was absolute biblical and incredibly satisfying to watch from a distance. By Monday morning, the Preston family name was entirely synonymous with federal racketeering. The sports journalists who had eagerly arrived at the athletic club to document a charity exhibition had instead been handed the financial scandal of the decade. The highly edited, unflattering photographs of Trent and Hunter, sobbing in federal handcuffs, were plastered across the front page of the Wall Street Journal, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and every major television news network in the country. The media didn't hold back. They aggressively dismantled the illusion of the self-made real estate mogul, exposing the massive predatory Ponzi scheme for exactly what it was. Because Trent had forged Jada's signature on dozens of unsecured offshore loans, the federal government immediately froze every single asset tied to her name. The sprawling estate with the infinity pool was seized by federal marshals. The luxury vehicles were towed out of the driveway before sunrise. Jada, entirely abandoned by her wealthy in-laws and left completely destitute, was forced to pack her designer clothes into black garbage bags and move into a cheap, roadside motel on the outskirts of the city. The elite socialites, who had once air-kissed her cheeks at neighborhood barbecues, instantly blocked her phone number. She was a toxic liability, entirely exiled from the high society world she had sacrificed her own blood to infiltrate. But perhaps the most profound and devastating justice was reserved for my mother. Evelyn had spent decades meticulously crafting a facade of moral superiority and elite status within her regional Baptist community. That facade shattered violently on Sunday morning, when she arrogantly walked into the church sanctuary expecting to seek sympathy from her congregation regarding the terrible misunderstanding involving her son-in-law. She was not met with warm hugs or comforting words. She was met with a wall of absolute icy hostility. The elderly women she had played cards with for 20 years, the very same women whose retirement accounts Trent had systematically drained with Evelyn's blind enabling support, stood up and turned their backs to her as she walked down the aisle. The pastor paused his sermon, looking at her with a mixture of profound sorrow and deep anger. No one shouted. No one threw anything. The deafening, collective silence of a community completely rejecting her was vastly more painful than any physical blow. Evelyn stumbled out of the church, weeping uncontrollably, finally realizing that in her desperate pursuit of white wealth and status, she had actively destroyed the only people who had ever genuinely cared about her. She had nothing left. No money, no status, and no family. A's for the stolen pension funds. The federal recovery process for embezzled capital usually takes years of exhausting litigation, often leaving the victims with pennies on the dollar. But I was not about to let my grandmother's community suffer through a decade of bureaucratic red tape. On Tuesday afternoon, I logged into the executive treasury portal of Aegis Global. I authorized a highly secure anonymous corporate philanthropic grant. Within 24 hours, the exact monetary value of the stolen retirement funds was quietly and seamlessly wired back into the individual accounts of every single elderly victim Trent had defrauded. The media attributed the miraculous recovery to a rapid federal seizure, but Marcus and Darius knew the truth. Aegis Global had absorbed the cost without a second thought. To me, it wasn't a financial loss. It was the cost of restoring balance to my grandmother's neighborhood. That evening, I sat on the porch of the dilapidated little house that had started this entire war. The summer air was thick and humid, filled with the familiar, comforting rhythm of chirping cicadas. I wore my worn-out combat boots and a faded military t-shirt, holding a cold glass of sweet tea in my hand. I looked out at the massive oak trees lining the driveway. There were no arrogant real estate developers threatening my perimeter. There were no hired thugs creeping through the shadows. The suffocating weight of my mother's toxic expectations was permanently severed from my life. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, and entirely safe. I took a slow sip of my tea, feeling the cool liquid soothe my throat. I had walked into their glittering, arrogant world, dismantled their fraudulent empire piece by piece, and walked out without a single scratch. I leaned back in my grandmother's floral-patterned chair, watching the sun slowly set over the Atlanta skyline. The property was officially secure. The mission was accomplished, and for the first time in 15